All right, so thanks everyone for having me. It's a real honor to be speaking with you today at Regional Scrum Gathering Nepal 2022. And well, before I start, I'd like to thank the organizers for their dedication and commitment, putting in their personal time to make this hybrid event possible. It is no mean feat, it is a lot of work.
Awesome.
Yeah. So while I'm speaking, hope you have a good coffee break and enjoy the presentation. Today, what I'll be speaking on is the service of an executive coach, which is a topic that, in my view, at least, deserves greater attention now more than ever. So I'm going to share my screen now. A minute. All right, can you see my screen?
Yeah. Yes.
Thanks. Thank you. So at the end of this session, I promise you will know the difference between executive coaching as compared with standard enterprise agile coaching and team agile coaching. You also understand what executive presence is, and you'll be able to design learning interventions for your organization and for your executives, right? So my name is Victor. I'm the founder and head coach of Visionary Agility, an enterprise agility and leadership consulting practice based in Singapore. I'm an ICF PCC, a Scrum Alliance CSP, a licensed Belbin provider, and I'm certified in various scaling frameworks as well. So let's head right in. What is the state of executive leadership today? Right. As we have seen and already experienced, the pandemic has rattled the business environment that we were used to, right? And that has led to trepidations in executive decision-making since it started. And so executives are, well, everyone for that matter, are forced to operate in a deeply unfamiliar environment. And for executives, this is especially unsettling. We find ourselves being catapulted from complexity to chaos. And these are testing times, even for leaders whom are familiar with personal and enterprise agility. And so, in my estimation, the executive coach's duty matters now more so than ever before. And now, before we head into the meat of executive coaching itself, right? Some empathy, coaching empathy is necessary, right? So what entails the life of an executive? Right? If, speaking with executives over the last 5 years, some of which I've had the privilege of coaching as well, the commonality is that all of them are in the business of making decisions all the time. And they make something like 20 to 40 decisions, important to not important decisions a day, right? And in order for them to be able to make good decisions, they need to rely on solid, well-grounded data, right? That means less anecdotes, uninformed opinions, biases, and those sorts of things. And today, executives are increasingly finding themselves in situations wherein they have to make decisions in the absence of data, right? In other words, relying on gut feel sometimes. And at the same time, as we know, many of them are constantly under pressure from their board of directors and shareholders. So it is a very stressful job. Very often, 3 bad decisions and they would be out, right? So you can imagine, right, having to make decision in face of uncertainty when they don't really know, and trying to convince the rest of the organization that they know what they're doing, that they are leading the way, and that they're leading the organization out of darkness. That is a lot of imposter syndrome, right? So having said that, the empathy for executives. Many a times as agile coaches, we like to convince ourselves that agile coaching is not the same as professional coaching, right? Because we do training, mentoring, advising, consulting, facilitating, those sorts of things. So there's a mix of process and content. Now, especially in executive coaching, I'd like to urge everyone to wear primarily the coaching hat, right? And dance the coaching dance. This is really important, as we will see later in this presentation. And this means that we mustn't excuse ourselves from this fundamental duty, because the focus on process is the critical dimension that drives high performance. So then, what does executive coaching entail? And how is it different than the standard forms of agile coaching and Scrum Mastery that we often see? Right. So I believe all of us would have seen a diagram like this before, or be familiar with operating as an agile practitioner in such a space described on the left. So there are, within the team level, the team coach, for example, the Scrum Master. And then there are also the agile coach, who coaches in between teams and middle management, or even to director level. And then the enterprise agile coach often operates at the leadership level, the organizational level, and deals with structures and culture, right? So fair enough. But why do agile transformation drag on for years without the organization actually becoming agile? Right? We see this all the time, and they just keep repeating the process of hiring agile consultants and agile coaches to effect change. Now, perhaps some of us would already know this, and in some ways it is a bit cliche, but we know that leadership themselves usually aren't embracing agile principles in this case, and also the required leadership stance. And as we know, real change can only happen with the leaders. So the other thing we do know is getting leaders to attend a 2-day course on agile leadership doesn't seem to work. So what's the magic formula? Now, unlike the rank and file staff, executives are at the front line of navigating the unknown with respect to the business, right? And this is the form of leadership that they provide, right? Defining the business direction, setting the course, steering the company past obstacles and competition, and then owning the risk of every decision that they make. Right? All of this, again, with very limited visibility, using educated guesses and gut feel, and sometimes collective decision-making at the executive team level. Now, with that said, it's become imperative for executives to learn as quickly as they can what is happening within and outside of their companies. And this is to aid the speed and accuracy of their decisions. As we know, executive decision-making, especially as it pertains to external environments, cannot wait. It must be made in a timely and accurate and sharp manner. So while the rest of the organization, right, the agile coaches, the teams, the developers, may have the privilege of demanding sometimes, of being in a safe space or safe to fail or learning from failure environment, there is no such privilege for executives. Again, 3 strikes and they're out. So with that, right, executive coaching focuses a lot more on the leadership stance and the enablement of structures that support self-management. And in my estimation, there would be 3 main dimensions to this. Reducing the micro decisions that executives have to make, designing learning interventions that would help the organization and the executives understand what's going on within the company, and most importantly, your presence, acting as the executive team's trusted advisor. And these three dimensions are what we will be talking about for the rest of the presentation. Now, why are executives today mostly in the business of making micro decisions? Right? Now, this is observed especially so in organizations with a strong power distance. Right? In other words, people are not authorized to decide and they're not empowered to decide. Now, there is a lot of conflation among agile practitioners today around empowerment and authorization. Now, these two don't mean the same thing when we speak from the perspective of a coach. When we say empowerment, it could mean that the individual is uncomfortable with having to make a decision, either because they don't know whether they can make that decision, or they don't want to bear the accountability, or they just don't know or never thought about it, never crossed their mind to make the decision, right? So authority in such organizations tend to end up being projected upwards to leadership. So I'm going to pause my screen share here to bring your attention to this paper point, which I believe many of us will have seen some form of today. The comparison between a hierarchical organization and a holacratic organization. Now, we know, well, at least many people advocate for organizations to operate as a holarchy. But with respect to what we just talked about, right, in high power distance environments, decisions often, or approval requests often propagate upwards to leadership, right? So imagine the entire organization being reluctant to make decisions at their level, right? And then seeking approval upwards step by step until it reaches executive leadership, right? This is one of the most common reasons for why executives end up making micro decisions, many of which are trivial and that they don't really have to make. Right. So in a holacracy, most decisions can be made within teams, and the assertion or the contention is that people will be happier because they feel trusted to make important decisions for the company, independent of scrutiny and micromanagement from their managers. Now, this is usually the case in a well-functioning holacracy, and the reason for people being happier are usually not due to that they have that authority per se, more so that they feel trusted. Now, even though we do know that, and many leaders do as well, attempts at implementing holacracy tend to follow the pattern described here, right? Leaders, first of all, leaders are sold or they learn from somewhere about the concept of a holacracy. They hire change management consultants to reorganize the company. The teams are formed, and then there are some skirmishes, they fight, and we are familiar with the Tuckman model, right? But they settle in gradually at some point. Now, this is where things get interesting. People still go to their managers for approval. And managers approve some requests while escalating others, meaning not very different from how it has ever used to be. And decisions end up still being slow, or there is a long decision latency, in other words, because leaders continue to make micro decisions. And then people start laying blame on, the holacratic model, on leadership engaging these consultants and so forth. Now, is this familiar to those of us, especially Scrum Masters? Now, there's often a similar pattern for new Scrum Masters trying to effect change at the team level, right? We learn about this great framework called Scrum. We are convinced of the benefits that it can bring, that it can that it can help us work towards delivering value to our clients and our customers. And when we try implementing it to the team, the Scrum Guide and bringing up the Scrum Guide, we provoke questions around all the specificities around the definition of done, how to do estimates, how to actually plan for our sprint meetings. And then when things don't work out, people start blaming Scrum as an academic framework. Right? So now, fundamentally, this happens because we approach the problem as in the mode of instruction. Like in the case before, leadership essentially directed the organization to become holacratic, right? So that is a contradiction of terms, right? Now, so this is also described in an article by Gary Hamel and Michelle Zanini in HBR in 2016. Now so I'll just read out what they wrote here. There is something inherently contradictory about using authoritarian means to implement a management model aimed at enhancing self-determination. Nothing will sabotage the work of busting bureaucracy faster than an abrupt and ill-conceived move that creates organizational upheaval and unites opponents. All right, so now, imposition of agile practices are a bad idea in general. So I present to you now, and some of us might be familiar with this, the 8 patterns of open business agility that you can refer to in the Open Leadership Network website. So the 8 patterns are the clarity of authorization, interaction protocols, empirical approach, common knowledge, whole group process, boundary management, explicit agreements, all supported by the keystone pattern of leadership invitation. Right, so we'll just cover some of these in the remainder of the presentation as they pertain to executive coaching. Now, the service of the executive coach here is really to help leadership facilitate the development of healthy patterns like what was shown to you earlier, so that enterprise agility can actually be possible. Now, this in itself is a complex problem. Yeah. And by complex, I mean it really in the manner that's described in Stacy and Cynefin, right? Complex problems that are good to solve using agile practices and patterns. Now, in addressing a complex problem, an empirical approach is desirable, like Scrum. And this means we need to authorize people to solve the problem together with executive leadership. Now, sort of like a chicken and egg problem, right? How do we do this? How do we actually authorize people, teams, and individuals to solve the problem together with leadership? So the first thing as executive coaches is to help executives understand that changing the organization's authorization structure is vital to achieving enterprise agility. All right, so far too often we see organizations functioning in the manner in which work and responsibility is being delegated downstream. Now, what sometimes modern organizations fail to appreciate is that delegation works well in high trust and well understood domains. Meaning, if we reference Cynefin here or Stacy, it would be in the clear domain where there are best practices. And this is so because it is more straightforward to know upfront what sort of authorization is needed. Right? But in environments where we don't really know what sort of authorization is needed upfront, an empirical approach is necessary. And for an empirical approach, invitation works much better. So this is a comparison of delegation and invitation, right? As we would imagine, delegation requires minimal design. It's just essentially an instruction. And it depends a lot on power distance, right? It is top down, depends on formal authority, depends on reporting relationship. And, basically people who carry out the instructions carry it out, and either it's done or it's not done, right? So it generates minimal feedback. And on the other hand, invitation maximizes the generation of feedback because it puts the receiver in charge of what happens next, right? It sends the necessary level of authority along with the responsibility. It requires rigor in design, and it can be used in most situations. And so the similarity between delegation and invitation comes in here. It can be used in most situations, right? And they can get results. It's only that invitation tends to work better in empirical environments. And for us agile practitioners, this is a key point, right? Any agile framework or agile practice thrives on feedback. Because invitation generates a great deal of feedback, it can be used productively to improve the learning ability of the organization. Now, just a quick one around delegation, right? It's far too much the case in organizations that leaders delegate responsibility, but not the required level of authority. And in the worst case, they delegate work, which is essentially just giving work to other people, right? And that's not particularly engaging as an approach. Whereas invitation, right, is highly engaging, right? So maybe I'll just stop sharing for a bit again. Now, any invitation necessarily generates a decision, even if the decision is non-response. That is a decision on the part of the receiver, right? But because invitations come across, especially when it comes from leadership, comes across as sincere and engaging, people would want to make a decision at either an explicit yes or no. There's a greater inclination to do so. And that in turn generates engagement. And with engagement, we see results. So these are also part of game mechanics, which I will share a bit on later. Now, as executive coaches, our duty is to help executives design well-formed invitations. Well-formed meaning it's a real invitation, not a fake invitation. And what does that mean? It means there are well-designed game mechanics of having clear goals, clear rules, clear indication of progress, and opt-in participation. Now, nobody wants to play a game where they don't want to be there, right? So the opt-in part of an invitation is crucial in making it effective and drawing only people who are interested in engaging to engage. And invitations, again, as mentioned, trigger decisions, which trigger engagement, right? And therefore, it is a more attractive approach to self-starters and top performers. And the decision rights would be defined much more clearly upfront, as we shall see later in the intervention that I will introduce. Now, another thing to bear in mind is that top talent is always at will and voluntary. Now, a point on clarity of authorization, right? Most impediments to self-management are about the lack of clarity of authorization, right? So as I briefly mentioned earlier, sometimes people just don't know who should decide. And that generates a tremendous amount of waste, right? And in my experience, it's more important to have a shared agreement of decision rights. So again, a shared agreement, meaning it needs to be explicit, it needs to be propagated across the organization. preferably through a whole group process. Now, this is more important often in making decisions quickly than trying to force the organization to operate as a holacracy, or to do Scrum, or to adopt certain agile practices and so forth. Because only when decisions can be distributed to teams and individuals below leadership effectively, can the executive leadership team be freed from having to make micro decisions. Now, enterprise agility is fundamentally about empiricism. This we know, right? And we also know that empirical processes, essentially, we have progress being based on observation and experimentation instead of detailed upfront planning and a defined waterfall step. It is fact-based, experience-based, and evidence-based, meaning feedback, learning, and action is really important. So having said that, why is it that practice frameworks like Scrum or organizational frameworks like holacracy are being prescribed and imposed onto teams and organizations today? It doesn't make sense. Again, it's self-contradictory. It's a contradiction of terms. Adopting an empirical process like holacracy or Scrum requires an empirical intervention, meaning a self-managed event like open space technology. And open space helps in the forming of self-managed teams critically by moving the appropriate amount of decision rights to teams and individuals. Now, this is the basis of an effective OST event, right? Very often we hear people having attended an OST event as a great learning event. That's true, but very few people actually use OST for its real purpose of agile adoption and enterprise agility. So the thing with OST is that if it is a well-designed event with the game mechanics that I've described above, it is able to generate action and build energy, commitment, and shared leadership among the organization, right? It unleashes self-organization among the participants to address intractable problems or conflicts. Right? And this happens because the participants are the ones who raise the issues that matter to them. So then it is on the executives to authorize and empower these emergent leaders in taking responsibility for owning the issues that they raised in the open space event. Now, OST is a whole group process that generates common knowledge. It is supported by good leadership invitation. So again, just a quick pause. Now, for those of us who are not familiar with what open space technology is, right? It is succinctly captured in this paper point. And essentially, this is a whole group participant-driven event, right? All leadership does is to invite, based on the game mechanics that I've described earlier, participants to the event, explaining to them what the intention or the intended outcome of the event is at a broad level. It is to drive the goals of the people in the organization and not the goals of the leadership team. What the leadership team is there for is to support the organization in addressing the impediments or the issues that are raised at the event. So this happens through the life cycle of drafting a good leadership invitation, the role and responsibility of leadership in the open space event, the role and responsibility of the facilitator, and the rest of the organization that's participating in the event. And then make it clear that for the participants, their attendance is optional. But if they do attend, then there are a few things that we would like them to play along with, right? So if they have, meaning if they have important issues that they want to raise at the event, then they should do so. And the executive leadership team is committed to seeing that these issues are addressed at the end of the event, right? So the leadership commitment is vital. Now, the ideal conditions for OST, right? A burning issue, right, that matters to a lot of people in the organization. There's no obvious path forward. There's diversity of opinion as to what should be done in the given situation, and the decision time of yesterday, which, by the way, is what we experience in most struggling agile adoptions. So generally, the situation needs to be complex and not merely complicated. And as executive coaches, our duty here in the design of a whole group learning intervention like OST, right, is to brief the leadership team on a few important tenets of open space, right? Some of which are listed here. The emergence of new informally authorized leaders, right? And this happens automatically by virtue of having conveners show up at the open space event. And that these people would be those who take on the issues, are authorized by leadership. And so it's a good thing. It solves the organization's problems. Closed space topics. So there are going to be certain topics wherein the executive leadership has to make an assertive stance around not being able to address or to service. So, for example, a demand for a 30% pay rise across the organization, right? These things are what are considered to be closed space topics. And the leadership, at the end of the day, has to make clear what these are. And then, as mentioned, sponsor commitment on the book of proceedings. So some examples of which that they must demonstrate: they need to send the proceedings to everyone who was invited promptly, latest by the next day. They need to commit to taking action with everyone, especially the conveners. They need to signal progress, right? One part of the game mechanics, right? Signal progress by stating what actions are being taken right now at present time. And so they have to do this beyond the conference or the event, perhaps every 2 weeks or every sprint. And then inviting and authorizing emergent leaders to help take action on the issues. And with that, we come to the last section, the executive presence. And this is just a nugget of sharing that I like for everyone to take away at the end of this session. Now, as we would imagine, we need to carry ourselves differently as an executive coach versus when we are coaching teams or management or across teams as enterprise agile coaches. Right? Executives are high-functioning people in positions of authority. Right? So a certain amount of presence would need to be acted out on our part if we were to be able to coach them. Otherwise, they will not respect our presence. They will not respect our existence and as coaches, and let alone treat us as trusted advisors. So the presentation of self, right? Just to give a virtual example here, right? I actually wear spectacles, right? These are my spectacles. But wearing spectacles put a distance between my audience and me. Right? as trivial as it may be, you do feel the difference, especially the reflection of the light coming off my glasses. Notice the difference if I've taken off my spectacles. Now that difference is because of access. You get access to my face. You can see my whole face in this presentation. You can see my eyes clearly directly through the camera. Right? And that access or that sense of presence that we give our executives, if we were speaking to them on virtual media, is so important. They want to get the sense or the feel that you are looking directly at them. So that comes down to the second point of perception, is try to look as closely to the camera as possible, like this. Of course, if you are going to present some other material, as I am doing so right now, then a quick scan of the material might be necessary, but always try to return your eyes near to the camera. We may not be able to put it directly on the camera all the time for obvious reasons, but bringing it as close to the camera as possible makes a big difference in terms of presence. Now, the other thing is, for those of us whom are trained, give me a second. So for those of us who are trained in virtual facilitation, the other thing to look out for is the ratio of our face to the entire viewport. So try to keep it at least 1/3, your face filling up 1/3 of the screen at all times. And if you can, position your head at the center of the camera and keep your entire head in view of the viewport. Don't cut it off with this, right, or this, right? So that will play into visual dominance ratio, which I'll share later. Then the next is isopraxism, right? And this is a term used in anthropology to describe mirroring. So executives are going to carry themselves in a certain manner that's different than the rank and file staff. And in order for them to respect someone at their level, we need to be able to mirror their behavior and their manner of speech. And this is not unusual for coaches, right? We often say, as coaches, we need to meet our coaches where they are at. And this is just one form of meeting them at where they're at. Now, visual dominance ratio. This pertains to how much we speak and listen while looking at the individual, right? So different culture, this might play out differently in different cultures. In some cultures, especially in Asian cultures, people don't like to talk a lot, but leaders love to talk a lot. So the visual dominance ratio is going to be something that's important to be aware of in the context of the culture that we operate in. And next is observation and design. So this relates to how the executive learns, right? So for those of us, well, for that matter, anyone, right? There are morning people, there are night people, there are people who like to read, people who like to listen. So if we are delivering material or content for executives to learn from, it's important to keep this in mind, right? If the executive is not a reader, then please don't give him a book of 500 pages to read at his own time. He's not going to do that, right? And the fifth is quite obvious, keeping of confidences. For all purposes, I would say confidentiality is essential when coaching executives. Now, we probably hear of something known as the inner circle, right? There's going to be a lot of information that executives, or a lot of topics and issues that executives talk about that the rest of the organization, in their view, shouldn't know about, right? Now, if any of this leaks out in your conversation with the executives, the trust is lost instantly, right? So something to be very mindful of. And this is what we do as professional coaches anyway, right? We never share personal information relating to our coaches with anyone else, right? With other coaches or with friends and families or colleagues. So keeping of confidences is really important.
Victor, we are about to end.
Okay, sure. And the last part, challenging the executive. Now, part of our presence as executive coaches is that we need to be confident in challenging the executives on their mindsets and their way of work, right? So do not be afraid to raise your assertion, or if you see a problem in the manner that they're operating to them. Right, so that's it. Feel free to connect with me. I'm not sure if we have time for questions, but thank you. There was a rather meaty presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amit. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Victor.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.